All right, everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming. We're going to get started. I am E McNeill. I'm an indie game designer. I was a backer for the Oculus Rift Kickstarter back in 2013, and I've been developing for VR happily ever after. Right now, I have 2 games that are launched or getting ready to launch on upcoming VR platforms. So I'm going to talk about them first just to give you some background. The more recent of the 2 is called Tactera, and it's a real-time strategy game where you're controlling miniature troops around a holographic tabletop battlefield. So Tactera is not finished yet, but I have released a free demo already on the Gear VR. My other game, my previous game, was Darknet, which is a cyberpunk hacking puzzle game. If you're a member of the press, please tweet out this slide. Everyone else can ignore it. Darknet was first launched on the Gear VR back in December of 2014, and it's going to be an Oculus Rift launch title on March 28th. Both of these were pretty small games. The total budget, including my time, was somewhere around $100,000. And the team was only myself working full-time with the help of a handful of contractors working for a few months or a few weeks at a time for each game. So I'm going to be drawing on my experience working on these titles. So keep in mind that my experience is mostly with these small-scale indie games and developing those. So a short while ago, I saw a talk at the Unity Vision Summit from the makers of the game Job Simulator. And they made this metaphor that working on VR platforms is like trying to lay down the track when you're already on the train. And they say, it gets really crazy when you're developing for 3 platforms at once. And I agree. Meanwhile, I'm trying to do 2 games on all of those platforms, plus the Gear VR. Plus, I'm working on a non-VR game on the side. So the first takeaway for the day is this is a really bad idea. I'm having a lot of trouble keeping up with all of these platforms as they're getting ready for launch. But I do think this gave me some perspective on developing for VR. Because there's a lot of platforms that are all going to be reaching the world at about the same time. And I think picking which platform to target is one of the key strategic choices that somebody has to make when they're getting into VR development. So I hope to provide some of the perspective I've gained and talk about kind of a common framework for how we make that choice. And because of that, I think this talk is going to be most useful for developers who are just getting into VR or who are in the early stages of development. If you already have your own experience working with these platforms, nothing I say is going to override that, but I do hope that I can add to it. So one reason that picking a platform is a tough problem is because we already have this ridiculously large spectrum of cost and quality, starting with kind of Google Cardboard on the low end, and maybe going up to something like The Void, where you're taking over an entire warehouse and turning it into a custom-built VR experience. So in between, there's a whole bunch of things, most prominent, I think, being the Gear VR, PlayStation VR, Oculus Rift, and HTC Vive. So let's start by narrowing down this field a little bit. I'm leaving out The Void and other out-of-home VR platforms because that's kind of a smaller market and seems less approachable for smaller indie devs like me. Among the remainder, there's a big gap between the mobile smartphone-based platforms and the rest. But I want to include both of these categories because I think mobile VR has a lot of potential. And this gap, although large, I think can be bridged. And indeed, that's what I've tried to do with my own games. But I am going to leave out Cardboard. You might ask, why not Google Cardboard? They've shipped 5 million headsets last I checked. And the answer is because it's bad. I think Google Cardboard is a really well-conceived device. It doesn't pretend to be any more than it is. But I don't think it can compete with the other platforms from a developer's perspective. The technical quality of the experience is low enough that I do not want people experiencing my games through that lens, literally. They have severely limited features. Both of my games require a whopping 2 buttons and are not served by Cardboard in that respect. There's lots of different smartphones that go into it, so it's hard to ensure consistently solid performance. And then, from what I've heard from other developers, sales and revenue on Cardboard have not been spectacular so far. So maybe target Cardboard if you're making like a small free app for exposure, or if you're making like a 360-degree video. However, I would note that there have been consistent rumors that Google is planning to come out with some sort of higher-level mobile VR headset that might compete with Gear VR. So I think that has a ton of promise. And I think that's something to keep an eye on, and maybe keep in the back of your mind when I talk about the Gear VR today. So I am going to talk about these 4. And I think these are all good, viable platforms, though when I pitched this talk, I was under the impression that more of them would have launched by now. I don't think among these four that there's a clear answer or an easy winner among them. So this talk is not going to end with, therefore, develop for this particular device. A lot depends on your preferences and beliefs and situation as a game developer, and how those factors interact with the things I'm going to talk about today. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about the design implications of each platform, the experience of working with the different companies, and the market potential of each. So starting with the design implications, this is how your choice of features in your game affects your choices of platform, and vice versa. So they all have some things in common. One nice thing is they all have good engine support with Unity and Unreal, which makes porting between them very technically feasible. And then also, for all of them, it's VR. You have to deal with nausea, figuring out user interface, 3D effects, et cetera. So other talks will cover the details of that. But if you're just considering getting into VR development, you have to price this in to all of the different platforms. So starting out with the Gear VR specifically. Gear VR has no positional tracking and no wires. So I think it's no wonder then that John Carmack says that the key accessory for a Gear VR is a swivel chair. You can turn around as much as you want without getting tangled up. And so that kind of lends itself to stationary experiences, but maybe one where the action is taking place all around you. So that might be why we've seen so many turret shooters at this point for the Gear VR. It comes with a built-in touchpad, and optionally, you can pair a Bluetooth gamepad and use that. So input, unfortunately, is fragmented in this way. If your game requires a gamepad, you are limiting yourself to a subset of the Gear VR audience. I don't know what percentage of players have a gamepad right now, but I do know about 10% of the apps on the Gear VR store require one. The touchpad, if you develop just for that, then you're going to be able to have your game played by everybody. But the downside, of course, is that you're limiting your potential control schemes. The other big thing that the Gear VR has that sets it apart is performance. You have to render a 3D scene twice in 1440p at a strict 60 frames per second on a cell phone. And that's really hard. So it comes with some very strict performance targets. About 50,000 polygons is kind of the rule of thumb in any individual scene. That said, Oculus and Samsung have really done a lot to try to make this run faster and make things easier for developers. So if you haven't been following the platform, you might be surprised. You can make some really visually compelling games on Gear VR. It's just more difficult, and it's something that you have to design around from the very beginning. Oculus Rift and PlayStation VR I'm going to group together here because they share a lot of the same key characteristics. First of all, they both have some positional tracking available, but it's in a smaller volume that's not quite room scale. It encourages more seated experiences, or you can do standing, but the terms I've heard used are things like desk scale or rug scale, to contrast with room scale. With the second camera that comes with Oculus Touch later in the year, it's possible that the Rift can do room scale. But at the very least, it seems like not many people are going to have their systems set up for that. So it doesn't seem like something to target for developers right now. Having wires also makes it less ideal for the sort of swivel chair turning all around VR, because you could get tangled up. So maybe 180-degree experiences where action's taking place in front of you is more comfortable. And that might sound like a lot of restrictions, but it's ideal for a lot of different game types. So for example, cockpit games, third-person games where you're controlling an avatar, tabletop games or near-field experiences where things are happening very close, like Oculus Medium, the sculpting app, or like Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, are all great for this format. In terms of input, both Oculus Rift and PlayStation VR ship with a gamepad, but are going to have hand-tracked controllers later on with PlayStation Move and Oculus Touch. So again, this presents kind of a tricky decision for developers. If your game truly requires hand tracking, you're limiting yourself to a subset of the audience. Both platforms are running high frames per second. Wow, that's a lot of cameras every time. Cool. High frames per second, high resolution, and on pretty good machines. And one really nice thing is that they provide a consistent spec to develop against. For Oculus, they've gone out of their way to establish something they're calling Oculus-ready PCs. And PlayStation, of course, has the PlayStation 4, which is maybe a little less powerful, but the most consistent you can get. And so it's really nice to have that to develop against. It's a target, and if you hit that, then you're good to go everywhere. The Vive has room scale tracking. It's the only one where you really get to move around. But there are some potential complications that come with that. So for one thing, you're not guaranteed to have the same physically sized room for everybody who has a Vive. Some people might have 15 by 15 feet. Other people might have 10 by 10. So your game has to deal with that in some way. Maybe you allow people to teleport around the space, or maybe you dynamically scale your experience, or maybe you just design it around a smaller area to begin with. But you have to be aware of the potential of locking some people out of your experience if they just physically don't have enough space. The Vive also works for seated experiences, even though it can do room scale tracking. I've heard mixed things about that, though. Notch recently commented that he had a lot of trouble getting that set up correctly for the Vive. And I also think maybe it would be weird for, if people have to bring a chair out into the middle of the open area they've cleared out for their Vive. But if they're going out of their way to set up an entire VR thing, I don't think that's going to stop them. Input is not fragmented on the Vive. Everybody gets these tracked wand controllers. And again, we have high-end performance with a certain recommended spec to design against. And Steam, recently, they put out a Steam VR performance test so that people can see if their PC is up to the job. So here's what all of that looks like in a table. Yeah, perfect time for the cameras. This is kind of what I look at when I'm trying to consider what games fit with what platforms. So for example, my game Darknet, although I am planning to bring it to all of these platforms, was originally designed around the DK1 and Gear VR feature set. And so that really, I think, comes through in the final product, and not always in a good way. For one thing, it was built with this very abstract, low-poly art style. And so it works great on the Gear VR, 60 frames a second, no problem. And it runs perfectly fast on the other platforms, but my worry is that it's not taking full advantage of them. And so players might ding at some points because it looks like a mobile game, or it's not really making use of all the potential there. The input is ultra simple, so it works great for the touchpad, works fine with gamepads. But if you have tracked controllers, I'm worried it's going to feel like a waste again. There's really nothing nearby that you can reach out and touch. And then similarly, it's built so that it doesn't require any positional tracking. And that's great on the Gear VR, but it's not taking full advantage of the other platforms. And so there's nothing here that disqualifies the game from being ported to the other platforms. You'd rather have it there than not. But especially for the Vive, I'm worried that in my game, you're like floating in the void. There's no floor for you to walk on. There's nothing nearby for you to walk up and touch. And so you have this cool technology that's kind of going to waste. And so I'm worried that players are going to be able to tell that it's not really designed around that feature set. My second game, Tactera, on the other hand, was conceived a lot more recently. And so I had a better understanding when I made the game of what the feature set of these platforms was going to be. So again, it started out as a low-poly mobile VR game, so performance is solid. And then for input, I have simple gaze and select input that works fine, but everything's happening up close on a tabletop, within physical reach. And so tracked controllers work too. Things are actually happening close enough that you can reach out and touch them. And then for positional tracking, you don't really need it, but it feels really fantastic. And it's actually kind of, it feels like it's missing on the Gear VR. And one nice thing about this is, because it takes place on this tabletop, I can expand the size of the game area of that table really easily and take up the entire room if I want to. And so it works great for room scale as well. So then also, if an AR platform comes out, like Magic Leap or HoloLens, the game will work great for that too, because you could play it on your coffee table. So the game is not quite perfect for any platform, but it's very good for all of them. And this is a big reason why I'm really bullish on the virtual tabletop format. It doesn't require any artificial locomotion. It works really well for desk scale or room scale. You don't need hand tracking, but you can make good use of it. So contrast that with something like, say, Valve's Aperture robot repair demo, where the performance is really high and it needs a really powerful machine to run. You need tracked hand controllers to be able to play the game, and it's built so that you're wandering around the space of a room, and you need room scale tracking. So it can't run on anything except the Vive, which makes perfect sense. This demo was designed to show off what only the Vive can do. And I think for developers, that's also a totally viable strategy. I have chosen myself to make cross-platform games because I'm interested in hedging my bets, and I have these ideas that I think can work for all of them. But I'm not saying that's the only way. Maybe the better strategy is to pick one of these platforms and design something that's perfectly built for that, that takes full advantage of that can be some sort of unique killer app that you can't get anywhere else. Or maybe you're willing to make really substantive changes to your game as you port it from platform to platform. So again, to go to Job Simulator as an example, they designed that game around the Vive, but they're building alternative versions of every single level so that it can work better with the Oculus Rift, where it's a smaller space and things are taking place only in front of you. So that's a lot more work. But if you can do that on your game, which is not guaranteed, potentially that's the best of all worlds for the final product. So obviously, when you're making these choices, I think what matters most is what kind of game you want to develop and whether that can fit in with these different platforms. But this is, I think, a key strategic choice for people getting into VR development. You can change which platforms you're choosing to target. You can change the design of your game. Somehow you have to make those two things meet in the middle. But that's not the only factor that goes into what platform you choose to work with. So I'm going to talk about the developer experience. When you're picking a platform, it's not just the hardware you're working with, but also a company. So I want to talk about what it's been like to work with those different companies. I'm drawing on my own experience, but I've also made an effort to go and talk to other VR developers to kind of see what their experience has been, because it's become clear over time that different people have had some very different experiences. That said, by and large, the news is really good. All of these platforms seem to be generally developer-friendly. I've mostly heard good things, and I think a big reason for that is there's a high demand for games and for game developers right now. These companies need a game library for these platforms. They need an audience. And there's no big audience right now, so bigger companies are not moving in and sucking up all the oxygen. So indies are valuable again. Another thing they all have in common, working with them becomes so much better if they really like your game, and demos are the currency of the realm. If you want a platform's love and attention before or after launch, the best thing you can do is wow them with a really good product, with a really good demo. So I'm going to talk about Oculus in particular first, applying both to the Gear VR and the Rift. To get started working on a platform, you're going to need dev hardware. That's easiest with Oculus because dev hardware is publicly available. The Gear VR is being publicly sold right now. There's a ton of DK2s floating around as well. And if you have trouble getting those, or if you want more recent hardware, you can go to Oculus, and it's no guarantee, but they do supply devs with hardware. There are some publishing requirements for getting published on Oculus platforms. If you're on Gear VR, for example, your game has to work with their universal menu, or if your game is making too many people sick, or the frame rate is too low, or it's just not up to a certain quality standard, they might send it back to you and ask for changes. I've heard some developers complaining about this because they're saying the standards are not clear enough. And so Oculus has promised in response to clarify those soon. They've also introduced a new section in the store called Concepts, and that's meant to take in kind of the smaller scale, less polished, and more experimental projects. But I think it's a good idea, kind of a best practice, to get in touch with developer relations and show them your game early so that you don't have any nasty surprises down the line. Oculus is funding developers. I know this because they funded Darknet. I got permission to talk about that a little bit at GDC of last year. And this funding, this deal with Darknet, happened actually very early on. In 2013, they hosted a game jam, and they liked my entry to that. And so they contacted me and said, how can we help you develop this and turn it into something better? And that led to this deal, and that led to the full version of Darknet. So they are still funding people as well. Last year, they announced a $10 million fund for accelerating indie game developers. And I talked with them, and they've confirmed that that money is still being distributed. So if you're interested in that, if you're interested in pursuing funding, put together a demo, show it to developer relations people like Anna Sweet or Aaron Davies, and try to start that conversation. Speaking of developer relations at Oculus, they've been pretty great in my experience, and not just because they gave me money. Aside from the funding, they've helped out a lot with providing new iterations of dev hardware, providing technical help so that I could get up to frame rate, because I'm not the greatest programmer on my own, promotional assistance, and a whole bunch of other things which I can't talk about in too much detail. So early on, Oculus made this statement that they wanted to be good to indie developers. And in my experience, they've really come through with that. That said, other developers have told me that they've had a different story. I don't know the whole story here, but some people have told me they've had trouble getting their emails returned and things like that. I talked to Oculus about that, and to their credit, when they heard that, their response was, that should never happen. We're happy to talk to anybody. Here's my email address. But I feel obligated to mention that there is mixed opinion on Oculus DevRel. So talking about Sony now, to get started on that, you need to get a dev kit. And to get a dev kit, you need to go through Sony. So talk to developer relations, prove yourself, show them a demo, and get a kit. Get set up. Getting published requires the usual console-level hassle, which I understand is not nearly as bad as it once was. But you still have to do things like get a static IP address to get in their system, and then fulfill all of the PS4 publishing requirements before you get published. Like Oculus, their developer relations team is really good. They've built up a really solid reputation with the indie game community over the past few years. And those same people are involved with PSVR and just as reliable now. And funding, I understand, is also available from Sony. For example, they have a program called PubFund, which they describe as guaranteed royalties upon release of your game in exchange for limited platform exclusivity. I can also tell you that, naturally, they like you more if you can use features that are unique to PSVR. So, for example, if your game can run at a native 120 frames per second, or if you can do something like asymmetrical multiplayer, where one player is in VR and the other players are on the couch playing along, then they're more likely to support you. As for Vive, to get started there, again, you have to go through the company, through Valve, to get a dev kit. Those used to be incredibly rare and precious, but at the Unity Vision Summit, they gave away a dev kit to everybody in the audience, so I assume they can't be that rare anymore. But you do need to go through Valve or wait until you can get your hands on a consumer Vive to develop for that. Their publishing requirements seem relatively loose. They stated they don't want to play favorites or pick winners. Whether you get greenlit is ultimately up to their decision, but they do have this whole greenlight process that you have to go through to get on Steam, which can kind of be a pain. But it generally seems like philosophically they're trying to set themselves up as like the self-service lane of the VR platforms. And their dev relations seems to follow kind of in the same pattern. It's a little more hands-off. I haven't heard of anyone getting directly funded through Valve as well. And mostly devs seem to say good things about working with Steam. There were some complaints that I heard. Most of that, though, seemed to be lingering from earlier when everybody wanted a dev kit and nobody could get one. There also seem to be some people who just prefer a more hands-on style where they want to get more attention and more responses from the company. But most people seem happy. So I would say that the character of the experience of working with Valve is a little different, but it's not bad. So then I want to talk a little bit about the business side of things and kind of the market potential of these platforms, because if you want to pay the bills as an indie game developer, you will need an audience to sell to. So I want to look at the different factors that might affect the audience size of each platform. But the basic truth is that we can't know what's going to happen after all of these things launch. Again, I think as developers, you have to take in what information you can and then use your own best judgment from there. So the Gear VR, thankfully, has already launched, and we can talk about that in a little more detail. It went up for sale in December 2014 as the Innovator Edition, which is just like the Consumer Edition, but with twice the cost and no marketing. And most estimates I've heard have put the number of units sold at somewhere around 100,000 sold in that first year. In November 2015, the consumer launch happened. The price dropped to $99. The marketing started up in earnest, and sales increased accordingly. It's gotten a lot of marketing and promotion since then. Most notably, it's recently been bundled with pre-orders of the Galaxy S7. And so the audience size has a huge head start on Gear VR compared with the other platforms. Right now, there's a little over 200 apps on the App Store right now. A little less than half of those are games, and a little less than half of that total are paid apps, are not available for free. And among those, the average price is just about $5, and $10 is the most expensive. I've heard from Oculus that they're not seeing a ton of price sensitivity. That said, there have been a couple of games that launched at $15 and then quickly chose to drop the price back down to $10. So make of that what you will. My own game, Darknet, was in the very first batch of titles that were launched on the Gear VR and were put up for sale almost exactly 1 year ago at a whopping $10. It was by far the most expensive app on the store at the time, and I'm glad I went with that price point in retrospect. I really, really wanted to share my own sales statistics with you, and I don't know why, but I thought Oculus would agree to let me share those. So unfortunately, I can't do that. So here is a revenue graph with no y-axis labels. I still think this can tell part of the story. So at first, at the very beginning, the Gear VR store only allowed free apps because they didn't have a payment solution hooked up. It was that early. So once the game actually went up for sale, it had this general upward trend as more and more people came to the platform, which is actually really cool because I'm not used to launching a game and seeing the sales increase over time. Then after November, the consumer launch happened and revenue jumped up significantly. It did pretty well at Christmas. It was also included in a week-long New Year's sale, which did really well in January. Since then, it has come back down in February. I want to emphasize, though, this is partially due to my own tech problems because I couldn't update the game in time, and so it couldn't be sold on the latest version of Android. It also had reduced prominence on the store. And the numbers are not yet in for March, but the Galaxy S7 bundle has started to show an effect. And I've already sold twice as many copies in the first half of March than I have in all of February. So basically, I'm really happy with this progress so far. I think if I were a bigger company, if it was more than just me working on these games, it might feel a little slow. But right now, in the situation that I actually am in, it feels like it has really good momentum. Also, the thing to note is that this game started out by winning a prize from a game jam, and then it got funding from Oculus. And since then, it's had some side deals for things like regional distribution rights. So if you combine all of that side revenue along with the direct sales, it actually covers the development of both games, Darknet and Tactera. So for me, this early venture into VR has already broken even before most of the launches have occurred. So I feel pretty good about VR development right now. Tactera is also available on the Gear VR store, but only in the form of a free demo, which launched in December 2015. I can show the download graph for that as well. It's pretty much what I would expect. I'm very happy with the level that it's plateaued at, but I don't know if this tells me too much about how the game is going to be received once it does have a price tag. Beyond the Gear VR, the other platforms have not yet released. So all I think we can do is look at the context that's already available to us. So for the Oculus Rift, it's launching very soon. I know a lot of people were surprised by the price, but pre-orders have sold out through July so far. And most of the estimates I've seen, based on quotes from Oculus about how their manufacturing is going, estimate that it's somewhere around 100 to 400,000 units that have been pre-ordered so far. They've also commented publicly that 1 million units over the lifetime of the Rift would be great. So that's where they're publicly setting expectations. And Oculus Touch is going to be coming in the second half of the year. I don't know how that's going to affect sales of the platform or how it's going to do on its own or what price. For PlayStation VR, it's going to be launching in the first half of the year, though there was a report from a GameStop executive who said it was coming in the fall. Hopefully, we'll get the final word on this tomorrow or within the next few days. It's not clear what it'll cost, but Sony has set expectations saying that it'll be somewhere around the price of a new console. So I think probably that means it'll be coming in at or a little cheaper than the Rift. And it has a built-in hardware base of 35 million PS4s that don't need to be upgraded with new hardware or anything like that. So it's coming out later than the others, but potentially could be the most accessible of the group. And it's getting a lot of support from Sony along the way. The Vive is the most expensive of the group, but I think it might be positioning itself as like the highest end in an environment that's mostly appealing to enthusiasts and early adopters. So potentially it has a very strong appeal there. And it's being marketed through Steam, which is a great way to get in contact with that audience in particular. So I think there's a lot of potential there as well. So how do we make sense of all of that? When people talk about the emergence of VR, it seems to me that most people try to make an analogy to something that's happened before. Like maybe it's going to be like the console wars, where we have multiple stable platforms that are all in stiff competition for a long period of time. Or maybe it'll be like the emergence of the mobile app store, where you really want to get in at the start of this huge period of growth. Or maybe it'll be like micro consoles, which, don't forget, had a very prominent, successful Kickstarter and a lot of hype and GDC talks, but ultimately didn't get very far. Or maybe it'll be like the Wii, with a very big burst of popularity inspired a lot by the novelty of the experience, with momentum that kind of wore off after a while. Or maybe like other motion control peripherals, where it's a subset of the gaming market. Or maybe VR is this totally new paradigm, unlike anything we've ever seen before, and making analogies is stupid. I think the truth is, of course, some combination of the above. It has to be. So yes, there's going to be several viable competing platforms. And yes, you have this chance to get in at the ground floor of a potentially enormous emerging market. But yes, that's also going to be limited to a subset of the gaming market to begin with. And it will probably come with a flood of novelty shovelware experiences trying to cash in. But yes, it's also new and different in its own right. Probably not like microconsoles, though. So to sum up, target the Gear VR if your game doesn't need high-end performance or input or tracking. And if you believe in mobile VR and you think that's successful and you want to get in on that early. Target PlayStation VR and or the Oculus Rift if you have a high-end game that doesn't need room scale tracking, like stationary games, cockpit games, third-person, tabletop, near-field. If you want extra support or funding, or if you believe in either of these products individually. I think there's a legitimate case to be made that the Oculus Rift is the most polished or comfortable of all of the high-end headsets. And there's a legitimate case to be made that the PlayStation VR hits the sweet spot of quality and accessibility. And target the Vive if your game takes full advantage of room scale or hand tracking. And if you believe in those features. There's a lot of advocates for room scale who will tell you that the Vive right now is the only one that really fulfills the potential of VR. And I think if you are a true believer, then go all in for the Vive. And target all of the above if you're particularly ambitious, or contradictorily, if you want to hedge your bets. If you think VR is going to be successful, but you don't know which platform in particular is going to be the shape of that success. And if your game is flexible enough with regard to performance and input and tracking, that you can make that work. I think there's a lot of promise in all of these platforms, from mobile to room scale. And so all of the above is the path that I've chosen to take. So please respond to the survey. I'll be taking questions in the wrap-up room. And thank you all for listening.